In February 2021, representatives from Goldman Sachs joined a conference call to hear from a YouTube executive about a media company they were preparing to back with roughly $35 million, according to trial testimony. The voice on the line praised the company's performance on YouTube and said its numbers were real. But according to that same testimony from the company's own chief operating officer, the man speaking was never from YouTube. He was a co-founder of Ozy Media, using a voice-altering app to impersonate a YouTube executive. That single phone call turned a years-long scheme to inflate the numbers into a federal fraud case. This is how Ozy Media pitched its way to tens of millions in funding, and how one call brought the whole thing down. Ozy Media presented itself as a next-generation digital media brand built for a young, ambitious audience. It promised a newsletter, a festival, podcasts, and television programming, and it wrapped all of it in a story of explosive growth. Its co-founder and chief executive was Carlos Watson, the public face of the company and its lead pitchman to investors. To venture funds and private backers, the appeal was the reach, audience figures that placed a scrappy startup alongside far larger competitors. Over its life, Ozy raised tens of millions of dollars from people who believed those numbers. According to the Justice Department, much of that reach was manufactured. The case, brought by the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York, described a scheme that ran from 2018 through 2021. Ozy's leadership inflated the metrics that mattered most to the people writing checks: audience numbers, revenue, and the terms of its business deals. When a potential investor asked for proof, the company produced it. Financials were dressed up. Deals that were small or merely discussed were described as large and secured. The pitch worked because it was specific, and because the people delivering it had the credentials to be believed. What it could not do was change the actual business underneath the story. By early 2021, Ozy was courting one of the most demanding investors it could find. Goldman Sachs's asset management arm was weighing that roughly $35 million investment, the kind of money that would validate everything Ozy claimed to be. But Goldman did what serious investors do before a check that size. It asked to confirm the numbers directly with Ozy's partners. One of those partners was YouTube, where Ozy said its content was thriving. So a call was arranged between the bank and a YouTube executive named Alex Piper, who was supposed to confirm how Ozy was really performing on the platform. On that February 2021 call, the person introduced as Alex Piper told Goldman exactly what it hoped to hear. According to testimony from Ozy's chief operating officer, Samir Rao, the voice belonged to Rao himself. Rao testified that he used a voice-altering application to disguise his own voice, posed as the YouTube executive, and praised Ozy's performance to help close the Goldman investment. For a few minutes, the impersonation held. The bankers believed they were speaking with a man who ran a significant part of YouTube's business, and he was vouching for a company his supposed employer had never endorsed. It did not survive contact with the real world. Something about the call struck the Goldman representatives as wrong. Instead of letting it go, they followed up with Piper directly and reached the real YouTube executive. The actual Alex Piper had never been on any such call. Goldman walked away and the $35 million investment collapsed. This went well beyond shading a projection or padding a metric. Someone at Ozy had impersonated a real person at a real partner to move a bank's money, and that is the kind of conduct that turns a business dispute into a crime. For a while, the fake call stayed inside the company. Then, in September 2021, New York Times media columnist Ben Smith published an account of the impersonation and of the doubts surrounding Ozy's audience numbers. The story described the Goldman call in detail and asked whether Ozy's reported reach was real. Advertisers and partners started asking questions Ozy could not answer. Investors and board members who had accepted the growth story on faith suddenly had a very public reason to doubt it. The collapse came fast. Within days of the article, in early October 2021, Ozy Media shut down. A company that had spent years selling itself as a rising media powerhouse ceased operations almost overnight. The brand, the festival, the shows, and the audience figures all stopped at once, but closing the doors did not close the matter. Federal investigators were already pointed at the Goldman call, and impersonating a partner's executive to advance an investment is exactly the sort of thing that draws a criminal case rather than a quiet civil one. Federal prosecutors charged Carlos Watson, Ozy's co-founder and chief operating officer Samir Rao, pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate. His guilty plea and his testimony became the spine of the government's case. He had been the man on the call, and now he was describing under oath how and why he did it. Watson took a different path. He maintained his innocence and took his case to trial, arguing that he was being blamed for conduct by others inside the company. The trial played out in federal court in Brooklyn. On July 16, 2024, a jury convicted Carlos Watson on 3 counts: conspiracy to commit securities fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. That last count ties directly back to the phone call. Aggravated identity theft is the law's term for using another real person's identity to carry out a fraud. Here, that meant borrowing a YouTube executive's name and title to help win a Goldman Sachs investment. The jury held Watson responsible for a scheme in which that impersonation played a deliberate role. According to the Justice Department, investors lost in excess of $60 million to the fraud. In December 2024, per the sentencing, Watson was sentenced to 116 months in prison, close to 10 years, along with financial penalties. For a company built entirely on the promise of numbers, the final tally was harsh: a shuttered business, a cooperating co-founder, and a chief executive convicted of federal fraud. The scheme had run for about 3 years. The accounting that followed took far less time than that. There is a coda. On March 28, 2025, President Trump commuted Watson's prison sentence. The commutation shortened the time he would serve, but it left the conviction and the jury's findings untouched. On the public record, Ozy Media stands as a company found to have defrauded its investors, and Carlos Watson stands as a founder, a jury convicted of fraud. The lesson Ozy leaves behind is an old one in a new medium. A compelling story can raise real money. But eventually someone picks up the phone to check the story, and the person on the other end has to be who they say they are.